really still creeping up, we'll make a start because we know kind of time is precious and we've got lots of really interesting things to talk about. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're very lucky to have Kevin O'Neill here with us. Just before I hand over to Kevin, a couple of kind of basic housekeeping bits and pieces. We just want to say that we're very grateful to Governor Hub, who are sponsoring our inclusive governance campaign that Governors for Schools are running throughout this year, and that gives us the opportunity to have fantastic sessions like this, where we can all learn a little bit more about inclusive governance and what that means. If you do have any questions, if you're able to use the Q&A function, that would be really helpful. And then as we've got some time for those towards the end of the session, we can kind of pose out those questions and things to Kevin, but please do use the Q&A function. We will be recording this session and the slides will be available afterwards. So, great to make notes and things, but please do bear in mind we'll be sharing this recording and the slides afterwards as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kevin. Thank you very much for joining us, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Emma. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin. I am the Head of Education at the Inclusion Quality Mark Award. I previously had been a head teacher of 2 flagship schools for inclusion, and I'm also a schools inspector. A lot of my work now, though, is working with schools, with multi-academy trusts and local authorities on steering them towards creating cultures of inclusion in their schools, in their settings, and in their contexts. I think it's important to mention that from the outset that there is no school yet that I have visited or worked with that is 100% truly inclusive. But all schools have the capacity to build cultures of inclusion and belonging. And we at IQM work with schools to ring fence their current practices that are working very well. We do a deep dive into inclusion with the school at every level, and then we begin to future-proof the school. And you'll hear me talk today a lot about how inclusion is a verb, and that we see the actions that you take at a daily, medium, and long-term level. And I think it's the strategic actions that will be of interest, particularly to our governors, that do create these cultures of belonging in our schools. Okay, Emma, if you move on the first slide then, please. Okay, so hopefully across today's webinar, you'll get a feel and an understanding for the day-to-day inclusion agenda that takes place in our schools and how it is best owned and how we maximize the potential of all stakeholders. And indeed, I suppose from the outset, it is important that the inclusion agenda is owned by all stakeholders. And I set schools an ambitious target at the start that we lift levels of inclusion ownership up to safeguarding levels. If Ofsted visit a school and they want to know who is in charge or who is responsible for inclusion at school, everyone puts their hand up and says we all are. Well, when we visit schools, the schools tell us that they are inclusive, or it's plastered all over their website. But then when we ask the question, well, who's responsible for inclusion here? And they point the finger at the SENCO or the inclusion lead, and they say that he or she does a wonderful job, but that inclusion is their thing. Well, then what we see there are some schools that maybe think they're inclusive, but they've got people that are doing the heavy lifting, and the culture is not that deep. So we want schools to have the mindset from the outset that inclusion involves everyone and that we all own the inclusion agenda. That growth mindset and cultural reset form a huge part of school going for the Inclusive School Award of IQM. Also today, I'll talk a little bit about how we at all levels can create these inclusive cultures, be it the school management and team day to day. And also, I suppose, like I've said before, a key element is how the governor's body of the school can also help steer and direct the school towards creating a more inclusive culture for all. And how you can play your part as a strategist in creating an inclusive culture. and how IQM then can work with schools as school improvement partners to challenge the whole organization to become more inclusive and to lead to improve learning opportunities and outcomes for all our learners. And maybe that's one other thing that's important to note from the outset is when we talk about inclusion, we do mean all learners. It is not to be viewed through the narrow lens of SEN. It is all the learners in the school. When you start to adopt these mindsets at the beginning, then you're ready to move forward. And with developing a culture of inclusion, direction is more important than speed. What you want is all stakeholders facing the same direction and moving towards the creation of that culture. Okay, Emma, if you move her on one more slide, please. So, starting points for schools, for governing bodies and SLTs, thinking, well, what can we do to become an inclusive school? Well, the fact is, in 2024, June 2024, diversity in our schools is a fact. We have got a broad stable of learners, stakeholders, families, and staff in all of our schools. A number of issues are becoming more and more to the fore. How do schools make their culture more inclusive for LGBTQ, neurodiverse, pupil premium, English as additional language, traveller children, children from diverse cultures? How do we make our school fully inclusive to meet the needs of our different learner types and the range of abilities in the same classroom? How do we make our curriculum mapping inclusive, that our curriculum appeals and motivates all learners? And when you've got a diverse group of stakeholders, you have to accept that fact as your starting point. So schools that again do very well with IQM have a very strong sense of self. They know who is in their school. They know what works well. They're very strong on their current practices, their pedagogies and policies. And they embrace the diversity that is in their midst. And once a school has a strong sense of self, they begin to chase down inequity. And that's the key aspect of becoming an inclusive school. A school that has a strong sense of self can absolutely then determine through self-evaluation, robust self-evaluation, where inequity may lie within the school. And then the choices that are made by school leadership and by governors to chase down that inequity. Which stakeholders, families, members of staff, and the community are on the margins of the school? And what can we do to address that? That's the decisions that we make. They're the choices that we make, the pivotal choices. So that's why we view inclusion as an action. Inclusion are your daily, medium, long-term actions and strategies that you put in place. Your mitigations, your interventions, your tweaks, your adaptations, all through a strong process of togetherness and consultation. That's what inclusion is. So inclusion is ongoing actions. And what you ultimately want to create is a school that is the hub of the community at its heart, and belonging the outcome for all stakeholders and all learners. Okay, Emma. So I had mentioned at the start that I have been a head teacher of 2 different inclusion quality marks schools. And you'll see on the left-hand side of this graphic, both schools that I led were flagship schools for inclusion. They'd been through the process over a number of years. Entered as an inclusive school, and then sought to chase down inequity, became a centre of excellence, and ultimately went on to become a flagship school for inclusion. Without a doubt, the inclusion quality mark and the framework that IQM provide, the milestones and the stepping stones, helped us establish our strengths as a school, and it enabled my team to deliver excellence and equity across the board. We understood the needs of our learners much more by being in the IQM family, and particularly our vulnerable learners, our EAL, traveller children, those who suffered any form of disadvantage, or indeed children in special needs. There was a lot of crossover between the areas I've already mentioned, and you can see some of the groups there that we were able to pinpoint as to how we felt we could better improve our provision. And the IQM framework gave us steer and direction and give us insight into how high performing schools were meeting their inclusion agenda. I think as a head teacher and as a governor, I was particularly interested in the aspect of IQM where they build significant capacity in the school in middle and aspirational leaders. Those stakeholders, those key drivers of school improvement that will be with you for the next 2 to 4 years, you bring them deeper into the school development questions in their careers than previously they'd expected. And you begin to coach and instill a growth mindset in them. I mentioned there that IQM visit a school, and when everyone runs and points at the Senko or the inclusion lead and says they're responsible for inclusion, it is this cohort of people that you actually are going to enable to drive change. You won't actually have a culture of reading and writing in your school if you cannot adopt an inclusive mindset as to how you're going to grow your subject. Not every child likes to pick up a book or is well versed in writing. So what adaptations and tweaks are you prepared to make as a coordinator that will truly embrace all of the learners in your school? This is the thought process that starts to move around middle management and senior leadership management. This is where you want inclusion to move around like osmosis in the school. And it does allow for the opportunity. And a lot of schools will say this after IQM, particularly 12, 18, 24 months afterwards, about the absolute value and culture shift that this has had by focusing in on inclusion. So many aspects of school improvement, you're joining the dots and you're aligning people together, that they are a team, and the process of inclusion is very holistic. And the schools I led, without a doubt, would identify now as saying they are proudly inclusive. It's who they are, and it's something they do not want to surrender lightly. Okay, Emma?
Thank you. Just as we're moving on to the next slide, we've just had a quick question come in about, could we clarify what we mean by an EAL learner? So I thought maybe we could just address that one as we move on. Thank you.
EAL, so English as additional language. And indeed, in the second school that I led, we moved on from maybe categorizing people as EAL to accentuate. One of the inclusion lessons that we learned was that it's maybe better to, rather than categorize children as EAL, as to amplify their status, their intellect as bilingual learners. The fact that they have the capacity, they know 2 or more languages, that they are polyglots, is an asset to the school. So that's what we understood that a lot better by working with IQM and embracing what is working particularly well for certain cohorts of children. So schools that work with IQM across the whole school will be involved in the consultation process. And we have got 8 pillars of inclusion, 8 elements that will align to your SDP and areas that we would ask the school to take a deep dive into inclusion, to benchmark your current practices, your policies, and your pedagogies against our national standards for inclusion, which we call the 8 elements. Schools that go through the process can avail of support, coaching, and mentoring depending on their size, capacity, and need. And we try and make that support as bespoke as possible. Certainly, schools at the start of the process do need a lot of confidence building and evidence that this is working and what they should do, tangible steps. And then they soon begin to gather momentum and wins along the way. But you'll notice there, maybe element 1 and 2 would be of particular interest to governors. What are the inclusion values of the school? What are your mission, your values, your aims, and your vision? And how demonstrable is it? Where do we see its impact? Is it just in your glossy prospectus and on the website? Or is it permeating every classroom in your school and ultimately impacting upon all learners? Do you need to do a SWOT analysis or to look at that where areas of enhancement can be found? And element two, leadership, management, and accountability. Something that a lot of governing bodies involve themselves in this process. It's where they are equipped and knowledgeable about the inclusion agenda, and it's how they then best add challenge and support to the school in equal measure. You can look there, elements 7 and 8 are where we really reach out to the school's community. We look at how inclusive your curriculum is in element 3, the standards of teaching and learning in element 4, how effective assessment is in the school, catering for the needs of all your learners. And of course, assessment by design is supposed to inform future planning. So if you're repeating the same mistakes year on year, is there time there for a school to reflect and embrace new ideas that come out of the wealth of data that assessment can produce? Element 6, behavior, attitudes to learning and personal development. How do we holistically develop the child? What are our behavior policies in school? What are we really trying to produce? Behavior is a form of communication. How are we looking to lower levels of exclusion and by design improve levels of inclusion? So that's what we would ask schools to look at across maybe between 2 and 4 academic terms. It's usually how long it takes for a school to be assessment ready, between 2 and 4 academic terms. And they'll take time and staff meetings, and across the year it begins to grow and evolve itself. But it's important that stakeholders are involved in this process, be it the pupil voice, the governing body, parental bodies, schools in nearby locales, whether it's year 6 to year 7 transition or transition into the primary school. Internal transitions we look at as well. That gathering of information and sharing it and making what is good practice explicit across the organization. Okay, Emma. And indeed, I've maybe just summarized this next slide already, but the whole point of the self-evaluation report maybe is more encapsulated in the second point there. You're building leaders and you are future-proofing your school. And by design, it should be distributive in leadership. And again, I might work with head teachers and governing bodies as to how this can be actually be factored into performance review. The idea that we can manage and measure the impact of a growth mindset in terms of inclusion at classroom level or teaching assistants, the different interventions they've learned and engaged in professional development about, key stage leaders, curriculum leaders, middle leaders, everyone. It is not a job for the SENCO alone. Although, to be honest, at the end of the process, it's often the SENCO who is happiest. Their vision for the school is genuinely being owned and understood by more. You often hear stories when we speak to SENCOs who are tasked with being the inclusion coordinator in the school, that 2 or 3 times a year they'll get one staff meeting and they'll present to their colleagues, and everyone will sit there and have a cup of tea and some nice bourbon biscuits, and they'll agree with every word he or she says, but the following day it's revert to type because there hasn't been the passing on and the ownership of the inclusion agenda. It's when the whole school are committed to inclusion that you do see cultural shift. Distributive leadership is a key aspect of that. Okay, Emma. So moving maybe more specifically into how you can enhance your school's culture. So your school culture is how you would define your day-to-day running of the school. And I know as a head teacher, if I was in my office, I genuinely hoped and expected and seen and realized without a doubt that my message was being lived and breathed around the school even when I wasn't there. There was discretionary effort and understanding of the process. The ethos was evident. Now, ethos is the Greek word for character. So is the character of your school truly inclusive at all levels? Well, it's an ongoing journey for everyone. But what you want to do is, when you find wins and accumulate them along the way, is to make sure everyone is aware of them, to acknowledge them, to reflect upon good practice, and to hold it tight, and to learn from areas where perhaps you've identified times where your culture or your standards are slipping incrementally. So your culture should be evidenced through the ethos of the school, through the routines and patterns and the behaviors of your leaders, of your students, day to day. How successful are their attitudes towards the systems and the approaches towards inclusion throughout the school? Okay, Emma. Well, one of the aspects that we encourage schools to develop and look at when it comes to culture is creating a culture where everyone can thrive. Everyone belongs, because the school at all levels promotes and creates an atmosphere and an environment of psychological safety. Now, what we have done there's a brilliant Harvard professor by the name of Amy Edmondson, who talks about creating psychologically safe organizations, schools, universities, blue chip companies, and how they promote and unlock talent in all of their stakeholders at all levels. And I think at IQM, what we like to see is how the school have created this culture of psychological safety. And you'll see that there's 4 different stages to getting this right. And again, it's a process. But if you put yourself in the shoes of either a new staff member joining and their first term or 2 in the school, or even more significantly, a new child arriving at the school and their first few days in the school, they need to be in a school environment where learner safety is paramount. That they are safe and able to learn by asking questions. And that they are allowed, as the days and hours pass by, to make mistakes and to take the right degree of risk as they experiment and learn, and to be allowed safely to make these mistakes, that they can feel genuinely. Some children don't always feel this, and we know that from speaking to children, that they are able to ask for help. That's the first one, about creating that psychologically safety. But also put yourself there in the position of an NQT in their first term, as they are learning their craft fresh at a university. They are still learning and developing their craft. And we know that there can be rabbits in headlights. They can feel overwhelmed without the correct induction and mentoring and support. And they will flourish if we can create this learner safety, psychological safety environment. Likewise, as they begin to progress, student and staff member and families alike should safely be able to challenge the status quo, even if it's just for clarity or maybe to suggest ways of improvements. And that when they express an opinion, that it is well received, it's understood and treated fairly. So all members of the school should feel that they can question others, including those in authority, and potentially suggest changes and expose, when and where necessary, problems or weaknesses. That is not prevalent in all of our schools. The vast majority it is. And if you're sitting there saying, you know what, yes, our school do this very well, well, then you are probably more along the journey of inclusion than you maybe previously thought. After this comes collaborator safety, where people genuinely are adding value to the school. to their learning. They are partners, parental partners in learning, governors adding value to meetings, giving their insight, their strategic knowledge, that everyone collaborates and contributes. And indeed, if you spoke to them, would feel that they own their own piece of prime real estate in the school. This is my role, responsibility, and this is how I am leading change or enhancing the organization. That might be adult speak, but at a pupil level, when you go into the right classroom and you can see that the hardest working people in that room are motivated children, and the teacher is there facilitating their learning, the teacher has worked incredibly well to create that collaborator safety. Collaboration between the students, fundamental. And ultimately, then people begin to say, yes, I feel fully included. And these will be aspects that the governors are thinking, is that happening in my school? Or are there aspects of what we've just looked at there that we can enhance or try and change or work upon? Okay, Emma. Amy Edmondson would also then talk about the learning zone. And she talks about stakeholders in their culture and where they can fall on this diagram. Ultimately, we want net migration from the comfort zone, the apathy zone, and the anxiety zone towards the learning zone. And if you get the conditions right in your school, you will have as many stakeholders as is possible at one point in the learning zone. There are a number of reasons why you may not and probably will not have your entire school community in the learning zone at one point. Some of the headings there, the comfort zone, the apathy zone, anxiety zone, are self-explanatory. People at different points in their career, maybe feeling unchallenged, or they different priorities. Maybe they've been overlooked for positions in the past. Maybe children have not been inducted into school just quite as well as the school had hoped. But by involving yourself in the inclusion framework, you begin to think of strategies that will enable the school to have that net migration towards the learning zone. In the learning zone, that is where your students and your stakeholders will thrive. And that is where you want to try and move people towards. Okay. So maybe as governing bodies, you start to reflect when you've at your governing meetings or between meetings or when you visit the school, your role in creating this. You know, the inclusive ethos, that character of the school does indeed start the steering of it and its genesis with the board of governors, with the head teacher and the leadership team. And maybe ideas for you to reflect upon thereafter this meeting. Is your school's mission statement truly inclusive? Do you know it? And how do you think it resonates on the ears, hearts, and minds of all your patrons? Do they know your school's mission statement? And do they feel included or that it resonates with them? What are your school's core values? And do you see them operational and the impact of them? Where do you see it? How do you know it's having that your values are having their desired impact and they're not just bland corporate words that have been, again, used with good intentions, but over time have been overlooked? How does your school articulate inclusion through your policies and procedures? Something I'm actually finding schools doing better and better when they're conducting policy reviews is they're making sure that statements are on point regarding how they want to articulate inclusion and what it will look like in their environment. And their procedures, particularly their teaching and learning, but safeguarding all procedures in the school are aligned to that inclusion values. And maybe even one more importantly for the head teacher and their team, but something that you may want to check up on. How do the daily routines of the students across the school, How are they really rooted in inclusive values for all, that respect and integrity and belonging is there for all your learners? Okay, Emma? Maybe something to get the ball rolling with yourself. If any of you there present or here present have a pen and a piece of paper just in front of you, just a sketching activity, but just something that you can be mindful of as you start to vision what your school will be like if it works on this agenda to have a really truly inclusive culture. If you could draw this Venn diagram, just sketch it in front of you. You can see the left-hand circle entitled stakeholders and the right-hand circle entitled learners, with the middle section belonging. That is your school or your multi-academy trust. If you're looking bigger than that, you're looking at all your schools. That is your school today as of June 2024. Which stakeholders and learners right now can you picture thriving in that center of belonging? Who are they? What do they look like? What groups are they from? What subject areas allow for people to belong? What successes have you had with curriculum implementation, policies, decisions made at governance level that have enabled a strong cohort of your school to belong? And what you want to do is find the reasons why. Why are they there? What has worked well, and what do we want to continue to work at going forward? And then you begin to unpick the model just a little bit. You look at those learners and those stakeholders that are not quite in the center of belonging. Who are they, and how far are they away from thriving in your school? Is it some short-term actions in terms of behavior? Sorry, behavior is not a short-term action. Is it some short-term actions that maybe can be looked upon, some policy changes? Is it medium and longer-term strategies that will enable more learners? Maybe families where trust is broken down over the years that maybe need to be looked at with a different approach or through a different lens. Is it new levels of staff training will enable more people to belong? Is it a new skill development plan? New issues that are arising? When you start to look at this, ultimately, you're hoping to have as many stakeholders and learners in that center belonging as possible. Like I've mentioned already with the learning zone, this is a fluid model. All of our schools are fluid. If you don't address inequity through inclusion, you'll actually see a net migration the opposite way. You'll see fewer and fewer stakeholders and learners feeling they truly belong in your school. They won't identify with the values, the missions, and aims. So that's where we're talking about the culture building aspect. Your day-to-day, your medium and long-term strategies that can enable as many to belong at one point as is possible. Your target is full stakeholder and learner belonging. Okay, Emma? The inclusion slide here, we provide schools with a self-auditing tool and the support necessary to build their culture of inclusion. A number of our schools will be aware of other schools in their vicinity that are worthy of a visit to learn a bit more about the process. I think at a governance level, there's a multi-academy trust in Swindon, the Grove Learning Trust that we're working with right now. And the governance lead at trust level has met with myself a couple of times because she wants to best support all of the schools in enabling and enacting a culture. So this is full involvement even beyond at school level, where the Trust Central team are taking a really big, long look at inclusion across the trust. They want to proudly identify as an inclusive trust, and they are looking at how, as governing bodies, they can make sure that aspects like recruitment and retention, there's a crisis going on. The recruitment and retention, you want to be able to attract talent to your school, and inclusive schools do that. And then when they arrive, you want to be able to retain them. And again, inclusion, schools that do inclusion and belonging and well-being very, very well, look deeply at practices about the retainment of staff and key personnel. And I think for governors at this time of year, the numbers of appointments that you need to make, I'm sure it feels like a carousel of appointments. So where schools can have a longer term view, well, how do we then, when we get this talent in the door in summer 24, how do we make sure we can keep them in our school for as long as possible, and that they can add significant value to us and us to them? Okay. Again, a little bit more maybe about us as improvement partners, but I think 5 core questions that will empower improvement at governor level. Question 1, I think if you look at your vision for inclusion and what has informed it, what is your vision for inclusion in your school, and what is the rationale behind that, and where do you see this going? Question 2, how is your school setting going about achieving its inclusive vision in this context? You know, a vision without action just becomes a dream. So when you've decided upon a fair vision for your school, that monitoring and that governance and steering of how they can achieve it. And then asking questions of your leaders. How are they monitoring it? How well are your learners doing? The ones that we've maybe targeted there, we've looked at there in the graph before, the ones that have been identified. And how responsive are your learners to the changes that are taking place in the school? How does your school organize and then define, celebrate, and embed success for all learners? What does that look like within one single lesson, or across the week, or across the term, or across the year? How do they celebrate and embed success? And how is your school creating the right conditions for growth and the development of the community, development of a community of learning? I think they're the kind of discussions that can feed well into a governance meeting, as well as the framework itself, which is step-by-step guidance. And I'm sure there's governors sitting here today that their schools are already involved in the IQM process. But maybe it's even more important and pivotal that they begin to involve themselves in the process itself and support the school going through their IQM award. Okay, Emma? And at that, I'm happy to pass over now to Emma and any questions that have appeared across the webinar.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you so much, Kevin. That's been really, really interesting and insightful, and some brilliant questions we've had come in. So if we start with this one, can you give some specific examples of how you tried to improve inclusion in your schools and how you measured if they were successful?
Yeah, inclusion does, I mean, strategically, bit by bit, the governor's having this open, frank, and robust conversation and challenging the school to have the meeting, whether it's an inset day or across the year. For the head teacher, there's almost an art form there, performance management. How do they coach and mentor their key personnel that will drive improvement? So I think the head teachers that know the personalities, have good levels of emotional intelligence, can expedite this process. Examples of it that have worked when schools have looked at nurture provision. Maybe some schools have looked at the pupil voice in the school, extracurricular activities, different ways of engaging parents, even the styles of assessment and report writing, parental dialogue, and having a focus on like I've mentioned already, when the school has had their assessment of IQM and they're aware, even more aware of the levels of inequity, you become part of the IQM family. And we have a very deep database of successful inclusion initiatives right across England, Ireland, and indeed international schools in all settings. And ever more, we're having school leaders contacting us and asking, we would like to address the year 2, year 3 dip in schools in terms of an inclusive approach. Have you got some school that has walked these yards before us in the IQM family that you can signpost us to? Other schools have had a focus in on staff well-being. I've said pupil voice is a huge one. Looking at digital learning, vulnerable learners. Post-COVID, where we're looking at improving attendance rates, and specific strategies that have worked with low attenders are different from working with the ones that are there from September right the way through to July. We have a very deep database. We can coach. Ultimately, we like to coach the answer out of schools themselves, but we can signpost and steer. And those schools that become centres of excellence and flagship, well, they join regional clusters of excellence. And they are then working 3 times a year in clusters of between 12 and 16 schools on inclusion matters. So there's a number of key aspects for your school that they can work with IQM on.
Fantastic, thank you. And actually picking up on some of those points there leads quite nicely to some other questions that we've had around perhaps examples of being able to engage with parents and how to kind of make sure that gathering stakeholder voice can be done in an inclusive way. So whether you've got any kind of suggestions or examples around that, please.
I think the key aspect of this is that the school recognise that the gravitas of the school parental partnership lies with the school. I will hear schools saying about difficult to reach parents. Oh, we've tried that. And they're at procrastination levels. And I accept that it can be difficult and challenging at times. Of course it is. I've been there. I've walked those yards. However, staff training and discussing, well, what works well and how do we reach and best know what our parents are actually saying? Communication is a two-way process. And if it is broken down, I think we need to look at some of the aspects of why it's broken down and how to build those bridges. And trust me, my experience would say the school are more likely to mend those bridges than to come the other direction. And yet the thing that unites both the parent and the school is they want the very best for the child. You want to make fruitful, purposeful relationships. So again, schools that join IQM will often flag this up as one of the areas for improvement. We would like greater attendance at significant parental events, for workshops. The schools that have done research into how they have better engaged parents of children of SEN. Some of those groups we have mentioned, there's crossover there. So that sharing of ideas of how these schools and the case studies that they have looked at pioneering research as to how they've improved upon this, that's all open to schools within the IQM family. It's what we like to share and build. We are school improvement partners. And I think there's nothing worth more investing in than the partnerships with parents and making sure they're fruitful and purposeful.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kevin. I think this is a really interesting one, kind of building on that again. So if governors are going into school for school visits, what kind of things might they see that help them understand what the culture of inclusion is like in the school?
I think if governors go in and they're very open-minded, you know, do take soundings from the day-to-day stakeholders there. Go on a learning walk. Ask for 2-year sixes to take you around the school and get their perspective. Be open style in your question. Just accumulate that knowledge and info. Governors have their fingers on the pulse. They do know, and they know how to. And I think that the key relationship obviously is that between the governors, the heads, SLT, but gathering that information and then looking for those marginal gains of improvement and giving their insight, their little bit of distance that they have from the day-to-day operations and their talent and experience they have from working in different walks of life or even working in the education sector. But when you visit the school, do try and absorb from a number of different angles, 360 perspective, all the while your brain thinking over, well, how can I maybe lend a little bit of insight where I've accumulated this knowledge. I will share it and feed it back best I can in a positive way. I mean, even the governors just think, well, how do I approach these conversations if I'm taking this back? But how they offer suggestions for improvement, I think again comes back down to that word relationships. If we're asking schools to improve the governor's relationship and the involvement in the school, the frequency of the involvement, having fruitful relationship and a vested interest, of course they do. So I think when governors visit schools, um, they're going in with a clean slate each and every time. They're looking to hear how it currently is and looking for things that are working well from their point of view that fit in well with that strategic overarching loop that they are constantly talking about in those late evenings.
Brilliant. Thank you. This is a really interesting one. So even if inclusion is a responsibility that we all share, what do you think about having a link governor with a responsibility for inclusion?
Yes, yes, yes. I think absolutely the schools that have done that get it. Treat inclusion like this because even if it's just down to the fact that this governor then is well versed at sharing with the other governors and dissemination and also just trying to understand the inclusion agenda, the same way you've got a link governor for numeracy, for science, for English, for school improvement, SEN, the governor that involves himself in inclusion matters. I certainly, if I was an assessor of a school, and I met with a governor who, and I have done, without a doubt, this is not a new idea, but I'm very impressed every time when I, as part of my assessments or inspections, meet with a governor that is well versed on the inclusion agenda and gets what the school are trying to build and also is I keep saying, adding value themselves. So schools that have linked governors for inclusion um, are very progressive and forward thinking and will reap the benefits of it.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's really great to hear. Another really interesting question that's come in. When governors are asking school leaders about what they're doing to ensure a consistent approach, what kind of responses might governors expect to hear? And I think that's a really interesting one because often as governors, we know to ask the questions, but we don't always know what kind of answers we might be wanting to hear. So what should we expect school leaders to be doing to ensure there's a consistent approach?
Honest answers from the school leader. You know, if it's not fully consistent, that they have got their eyes exactly on where that inconsistency may arise. Um, you know, that word consistency, I don't want to use the word cynical, but across a large performing school, it's very hard that everyone is at those high levels of consistency. So the head teacher being frank and honest and saying, you know what, at the moment, we are snowed under. There's lots going on. This is our current priorities. And the governor's accepting that. But as long as part of the longer term picture that staff are owning inclusion, go back to that learner safety challenger safe, the staff are allowed to make mistakes and reach those levels of consistency. I think what you want then from the head teacher is how they are ensuring that there's consistency. And, you know, I would be very impressed as a governor member if my head teacher was able to give me that frank picture, but was also then able to say, well, this is what I'm going to do about it. You know, this is how I want to improve it. I think it will happen in time. I know my team. And if you're hearing those positive sound bites that they think it's only a minor level, great. If you're not, just that's where you can step in and say, well, do you know what? You've told me it's not right across the board. What can we do as a team, as a collective, to ensure those levels of consistency are matched over time? Offer your support and your insight as to how you can improve it, particularly maybe of a younger or an experienced head or SLT who's taking over the reins of a school at a difficult time. You know, they're not going to be reaching high levels of consistency immediately. But I think that's where the governors, they've got a longer term view. They know they're developing people. With culture, direction is more important than speed. And having that relationship where you can ask these questions and seek the marginal gains, a strong relationship rooted in trust at all levels. When people start to adopt these inclusive mindsets, inclusive conversations that are constructive genuinely happen.
Brilliant, thank you. That sounds really positive. This is a really interesting one. Take it back to the kind of something we talked about at the beginning of the session. What are your recommendations about the frequency for self-assessment? How long would you expect this process to take?
Okay. If a school signs up for IQM, you actually have 5 years to complete the award. Now, very rarely does it take that, but well aware working in schools that a school could sign up with great intentions of going for the award, of building and enhancing their inclusive culture, but there can be staff turnover, there can be sickness, maternities, or a global pandemic might arise and it may not be number one priority. Truthfully, though, schools usually can complete the award, the process, in between 2 and 4 academic full terms. A lot of the schools that I'm speaking with at the moment in this summer term are familiarizing themselves with the project. This is why the 4-term length is probably 4 full academic term length is perfect. They're looking at this term at SLT and in governor level as to what this might look like in their school, so that when they arrive in September, they can press go with action plans and the agenda, and it's aligned to their school development plan. So it usually takes 2 to 4 academic terms to get there, but there's no rush. If it takes you 5 terms or 6 terms, that's necessary. Doing this right is much more important than ticking a box and saying that you're inclusive one day in time. You're looking beyond the plaques in my wall. Is that that wall? You're looking beyond that. You're doing this genuinely to validate and strengthen your school. When you come to the end of the 4-term period or the 3 or 4-term period, whatever suits, one of our assessors who will be a head or a Senko, someone well versed in the inclusion agenda nationally, will visit your school. And they will, through a positive line of inquiry approach, validate what they see as strong inclusive practices, and also then help steer and guide the school as to their next steps. It's schools that demonstrate a high capacity to sustain improvement. They would be considered to be centers of excellence, where you realize that your inclusion agenda is not just for one day. So you will use our framework, and if you're a school that's hitting around 85%, maybe 90% of all of our national standards, you're putting yourself in line to become a center of excellence for inclusion, with the understanding that going forward, you'll look at the 10 to 15% yards of inclusion, like the questions spoken about already, how to re-engage parents, how to make sure that culture permeates the school correctly. The hardest 10 to 15% yards of inclusion are those last yards. That's where you're really making decisive action, narrowing those gaps. We would then visit your school as a centre of excellence on an annual basis thereafter. But the lion's share, the deep dive into inclusion is initially. When you achieve centre of excellence status, thereafter we're looking at 3 or 4 targeted areas. The paperwork, the work is much less after that because we have quality assured your school's performance at a number. All 8 elements have been quality assured. But on an annual basis thereafter, we would want to see sustainability and that the inclusion agenda is deeper each and every year.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kevin. I think that leads us quite nicely onto the last question that I think we can just squeeze in the time we've got. What's the cost and requirements for getting involved with the award?
Okay. It is £129 plus VAT to register your school for the award. And upon registration, you then can avail of all the supporting documents and indeed our central team support for your school going forward. Throughout your school's journey, they have got access to webinars and internal support from our central team, giving guidance and steer as to how best implement it in your context. Nursery, special, primary, secondary, further education, and indeed in the next few months we'll have our first 2 Premier League clubs. Sorry, one's a Premier League club. Everton Football Club will soon be the first Premier League club to achieve the award, and with Sunderland fast on their tails being the first Championship club. 2 clubs that are rooted in the communities and the schools that they serve and work with. Costs depend on the number of students in your organisation. So the £129 is to register. The larger costs come when your school is going to be assessment ready. If your school have got less than 400 students, our assessor will spend 1 day in your organisation, and the cost for that are circa £14.50 plus VAT and expenses. And if your school have got more than 400 students, those larger primary schools or secondary schools, our assessor will spend 2 days in your school. And the cost for that are £22.50 plus VAT and expenses. If you then progress to Centre of Excellence, then the review costs, the annual reviews are significantly less going forward, but that would be the cost of entry. It's £129 to join the IQM family, to register, to go through the process. And then the larger cost, all available on our website. There's information packs there for people to download or maybe to take back to their heads or their governing body meetings and to look and discuss this. But the full pricing plan is there. I do know that the registration fee is likely to go up in September, though. It's £129 currently, but it's likely to go up in September.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So if people go and have a look on the IQM Award website, they'll get more information about all of that.
All the breakdowns there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who has joined us and for your excellent questions. And Kevin, thank you so much for your time. That was really insightful, and I've certainly been scribbling away notes and kind of things to take back and questions to ask in my school where I'm a governor. But we very much appreciate your time. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. We will be sharing the slides and recording of this shortly. So thank you so much, everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks. Bye.